Imagine 50,000 soldiers, the finest warriors of the mighty Persian Empire, marching confidently across the golden sands of Egypt, their bronze armor gleaming under the desert sun, their spears held high, their voices echoing ancient battle songs that had once struck terror into the hearts of nations. They were unstoppable. They were invincible. They had conquered empires from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. And then, in a single moment, they vanished. All of them. Not a single trace left behind. No bones, no weapons, no armor, nothing. As if the desert itself had opened its mouth and swallowed an entire army whole. This isn't a legend whispered around campfires. This isn't mythology passed down through generations. This is history's greatest mystery, the complete disappearance of 50,000 Persian warriors in the Egyptian desert 2,500 years ago. A mystery so profound that even today, archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters continue searching for answers in the endless sands of the Sahara. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet comfort of sleep, let us journey together into the heart of this ancient puzzle. Close your eyes and feel the warm desert wind on your face. Listen to the whisper of shifting sands that have kept their secrets for millennia. Because sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones where we never learn how they truly end. Welcome to Bedtime History. I'm your guide through the shadows of the past, where forgotten empires rise and fall like mirages in the desert heat. Tonight, we travel back to the year 525 BCE, to a world where gods and kings battled for supremacy, where oracles spoke prophecies that could topple dynasties, and where the line between myth and reality was as shifting as the desert sands themselves. Our story begins not in the desert, but in the gleaming halls of Persepolis, the crown jewel of the Achaemenid Empire. Here, in palaces adorned with gold and precious stones, ruled a king whose name would echo through history, Cambyses II, son of the legendary Cyrus the Great. But Cambyses was a man haunted by his father's shadow, desperate to prove that he could expand the empire even further than the great Cyrus had dreamed. The Persian Empire in 525 BCE was already the largest the world had ever seen. Stretching from the windswept steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean, it encompassed dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures, all bowing before the Persian throne. Yet for Cambyses, this vast dominion was not enough. His hungry eyes turned south, toward the ancient kingdom of Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the pyramids, and mysteries older than memory itself. Egypt in those days was no mere prize to be easily claimed. It was a civilization that had endured for 3,000 years, its culture so ancient and sophisticated that even the Persians viewed it with a mixture of awe and ambition. The pharaohs claimed divine descent from the gods themselves. Their priests wielded power that seemed to bend reality. Their temples housed oracles that spoke truths no mortal should know. To conquer Egypt would not simply add territory to the Persian Empire. It would prove that Persian might could overcome even the gods. In the spring of 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his invasion. His army was a sight to behold. Tens of thousands of Persian warriors, their ranks swelled with Median cavalry, Greek mercenaries, and soldiers drawn from across the empire's vast territories. They moved like a great serpent across the desert, their bronze armor catching the sunlight, their banners snapping in the wind. This was not just an army, it was the flesh. The Persians struck Egypt manifestation of imperial will, made at its eastern frontier, at the ancient city of Pelusium, where the easternmost branch of the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean Sea. Here, the forces of Pharaoh Psamtik III awaited them, determined to defend their homeland against the foreign invaders. But the Persians had learned the art of war from conquering a dozen nations, and their discipline proved superior to Egyptian courage. The battle was swift and decisive. According to ancient accounts, 50,000 Egyptians fell that day, while Persian losses numbered only 7,000. The Egyptian army, once proud and confident, shattered like glass against Persian steel. Pharaoh Psamtik's forces fled southward toward Memphis, the ancient capital, but their retreat became a rout. The sight of their fleeing king broke the spirit of the Egyptian defenders, and city after city opened its gates to the Persian conquerors rather than face destruction. By August of 525 BCE, all of Egypt lay prostrate before Cambyses. The young Persian king had achieved what his father never had: the conquest of the oldest civilization on earth. Memphis fell. The pharaoh was captured. The treasures of Egypt flowed northward to fill Persian coffers. Cambyses declared himself pharaoh, founding what historians would later call the 27th dynasty, the first foreign dynasty to rule Egypt since the dawn of recorded history. But conquest, Cambyses would learn, was easier than rule. Egypt was not simply a kingdom to be absorbed into the Persian administrative system. It was a land where every stone held sacred meaning, where the very rhythm of life was tied to the flooding of the Nile, where priests commanded the loyalty of the people through rituals older than the Persian Empire itself. The Egyptians might bow their heads to Persian rule, but their hearts remained unconquered. It was in this atmosphere of uneasy occupation that Cambyses began to plan his next move. Egypt was secure, but the Persian king's ambition burned as hot as the desert Sunday. He envisioned not just the conquest of Egypt, but the subjugation of all North Africa. His advisors spoke of expeditions against the Nubians to the south, against the wealthy city of Carthage to the west, and against the mysterious Oracle of Siwa deep in the western desert. The Oracle of Siwa, even the name carried weight in the ancient world, located hundreds of miles into the harsh western desert, in an oasis so remote that reaching it was considered an act of profound devotion or desperate need. The oracle commanded respect from Greeks and Egyptians alike. Here, in a temple dedicated to the god Amun, priests delivered prophecies that were said to come directly from the divine realm. Kings and generals from across the Mediterranean world had made the perilous journey to Siwa, seeking guidance for their most crucial decisions. For Cambyses, the oracle represented both an opportunity and a threat. If he could secure the oracle's blessing for his rule over Egypt, it would legitimize his claim to be not just a conqueror, but a true pharaoh, chosen by the gods themselves. The priests of Siwa commanded enormous influence throughout Egypt, and their endorsement could transform Persian occupation from foreign domination into divinely sanctioned rule. But the priests of Siwa were not easily swayed. When Cambyses sent envoys requesting their blessing, they met with polite but firm refusal. The oracle would not be bought with Persian gold or intimidated by Persian threats. Their god, they declared, did not recognize foreign kings, no matter how many armies they commanded or how many cities they had conquered. This rejection stung Cambyses more deeply than any military defeat could have. Here was a handful of priests in a remote desert oasis, daring to deny the King of Kings the recognition he demanded. Worse, their defiance threatened to undermine his entire Egyptian project. If the most revered oracle in Egypt refused to acknowledge his legitimacy, how could he ever truly claim to rule the land of the pharaohs? The Persian king's response was swift and terrible. If the oracle would not bow willingly, it would be destroyed. If the priests would not serve Persian interests, they would serve as an example to others who might dare to defy imperial will. Cambyses began assembling an army for a mission, unlike any other, not to conquer territory or capture treasure, but to march into the heart of the western desert and obliterate the Oracle of Siwa from existence. The army that Cambyses assembled for this desert expedition was unlike any force the ancient world had ever seen committed to such a venture. 50,000 soldiers, an entire legion of the Persian Empire's finest warriors, were selected for what many would consider a fool's errand. These were not green recruits or expendable troops, but seasoned veterans who had fought in the campaigns that brought Egypt to its knees. Immortals from the Persian heartland, their armor inscribed with prayers to Ahura Mazda, Median horsemen whose ancestors had ridden with Cyrus himself. Greek mercenaries whose bronze hoplon shields had turned the tide at Pelusium. Scythian archers whose arrows could find their mark at distances that seemed impossible. What drove Cambyses to commit such a massive force to what was essentially a punitive expedition against a handful of priests in a remote oasis? The answer lies in understanding the Persian conception of kingship itself. To the Persians, the king was not merely a political leader, but the earthly representative of divine order, the embodiment of cosmic justice itself. Any challenge to royal authority was not just political rebellion, but a tear in the fabric of reality that had to be repaired through decisive action. The oracle's refusal to acknowledge Cambyses as legitimate pharaoh was more than an insult. It was a theological crisis. If the gods truly spoke through the priests of Siwa, then their rejection of Persian rule suggested that the empire itself might lack divine approval. This was dangerous thinking that could spread like wildfire through the conquered territories, undermining Persian authority from Egypt to India. The oracle had to be silenced, and it had to be done in a way that left no doubt about the consequences of defying the King of Kings. As the army prepared for its desert march, the logistical challenges became apparent even to the Persian commanders who had organized campaigns across 3 continents. The western desert was not like the fertile river valleys where Persian armies typically operated. It was a realm of endless sand and stone, where water was more precious than gold, and a single wrong turn could lead to death by thirst. The distance from Thebes, where the army would begin its march, to the Siwa oasis was over 400 miles of some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. But the Persians had conquered the known world through meticulous planning and superior organization. Supply trains were organized with mathematical precision, water carriers calculated down to the last drop needed for the journey. The army would march in stages, resting at known oases along the route. Local guides, who claimed knowledge of the desert paths, were hired at enormous expense. Maps, such as they were in that ancient age, were consulted and recopied. Nothing was left to chance. The force that departed from Thebes in the early months of 524 BCE represented the height of Persian military efficiency. The soldiers marched in perfect formation, their bronze armor polished to mirror brightness, their weapons sharp and ready for battle. Supply wagons stretched for miles behind the main body of troops, loaded with enough provisions to sustain an army for weeks in the wilderness. This was not a desperate gamble, but a calculated demonstration of Persian power, a message written in bronze and blood that would be read by every potential rebel from the Nile to the Euphrates. For the first days of the march, everything proceeded according to plan. The army moved at a steady pace across the desert, following ancient caravan routes that had been used by traders for centuries. The men were in high spirits, joking about the easy victory that awaited them against a handful of priests who had never faced Persian steel. Water supplies remained adequate. The heat was brutal but manageable for soldiers who had campaigned in the deserts of Central Asia and the mountains of Anatolia. But the western desert of Egypt was unlike any landscape the Persian soldiers had ever encountered. This was not simply empty land between cities. It was an active, hostile environment that seemed to resist human presence with every grain of sand. The great sand sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its dunes shifting and reforming with each wind like a living thing that devoured landmarks and confused even experienced desert travelers. 7 days into the march, the army reached what historians believe was the Karga oasis, roughly halfway to their destination. Here they rested, refilled their water supplies, and prepared for the final push towards Siwa. The soldiers were tired, but confident. They had covered the most difficult part of the journey, and were now within striking distance of their target. Local inhabitants at the oasis reported no unusual weather patterns, no signs of the terrible sandstorms that could rise without warning from the deep desert. It was from this point that the Persian army marched into legend and mystery. According to the only surviving account of what happened next, they departed Karga oasis in good order, following the established caravan route that should have brought them to Siwa within 3 days. But somewhere in the vast emptiness between Karga and their destination, 50,000 Persian soldiers simply vanished from the face of the earth. The first sign that something was wrong came when the expected victory dispatches from the army commander failed to arrive at the Persian command posts in Memphis. Days passed with no word, then weeks. Search parties were dispatched along the known routes, but they found nothing, no signs of battle, no evidence of the massive supply train that should have left unmistakable traces in the sand. It was as if the army had never existed at all. When news of the disappearance finally reached the scattered communities around Siwa oasis, the local inhabitants could offer only one explanation for what they had witnessed. According to their account, which would eventually reach the Greek historian Herodotus, the Persian army had been making good progress across the desert when disaster struck without warning. As the soldiers stopped for their midday meal, probably seeking what little shade they could find in that barren landscape, the wind began to rise from the south. What started as a gentle breeze quickly intensified into something far more sinister. The desert dwellers recognized the signs, immediately the peculiar color of the sky, the way the air seemed to thicken with approaching menace, the sudden silence that fell over the landscape as even the insects and lizards sought shelter. This was the beginning of a khamsin, one of those legendary sandstorms that could bury entire caravans and reshape the very geography of the desert. But this was no ordinary storm. According to the witnesses, the wind rose to a howling fury that seemed to come from the underworld itself, carrying with it vast columns of sand that blotted out the sun and turned day into night. The Persian soldiers, trained to face human enemies on conventional battlefields, found themselves helpless against an adversary that could not be fought with sword or spear. The sand filled their eyes, their noses, their mouths. Their carefully organized formations dissolved into chaos as men stumbled blindly through the storm, calling out for comrades they could not see. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The wind died away, the sand settled, and the desert returned to its normal, terrible silence. But where 50,000 Persian soldiers had been eating their midday meal just hours before, there was nothing but unmarked sand, as smooth and pristine as if no human foot had ever disturbed its surface. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm itself. For in that vast emptiness, the desert had revealed one of its most chilling secrets, that in the face of nature's raw power, even the mightiest empire was nothing more than dust, waiting to be scattered on the wind. Word of the catastrophe spread slowly through the ancient world, carried by merchants and travelers who spoke in hushed tones of the army that had marched into the desert and never returned. In the royal courts of Memphis, Persian officials refused to believe the reports. 50,000 men could not simply vanish. There had to be survivors, stragglers, someone who could explain what had happened to the greatest military force ever committed to a desert campaign. But as the weeks turned to months with no word from the expedition, even the most optimistic Persian commanders began to accept the impossible truth. The army was gone, not defeated in battle that would have left bodies, weapons, some trace of their passage, not captured by enemies no force in the western desert possessed the strength to overwhelm 50,000 Persian warriors. They had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world as completely as if they had never been born. The psychological impact of this disappearance reverberated throughout the Persian Empire, like cracks spreading through marble. Here was an empire that had built its reputation on invincibility, on the idea that Persian arms could overcome any obstacle, and Persian will could bend any enemy to submission. Yet a handful of desert winds had accomplished what no army had ever managed: the complete destruction of a Persian force without leaving so much as a single survivor to tell the tale. In the oasis settlements scattered throughout the western desert, The local Berber and Egyptian inhabitants whispered of divine intervention. The god Amun, they said, had protected his oracle by calling upon the ancient powers of the desert itself. The sand had answered his summons, rising up to defend the sacred site against foreign desecration. To these desert dwellers, who lived their entire lives at the mercy of wind and storm, there was nothing mysterious about the army's fate. The desert gave life to those who respected its power and claimed those who did not, and the Persians had entered its domain with conquest rather than reverence in their hearts. But among the educated classes of the ancient world, particularly the Greeks, who were beginning to develop what we might recognize as historical methodology, the disappearance raised more complex questions. How could such a large force vanish so completely? Even the most devastating sandstorm should have left some trace scattered equipment, preserved bodies, something to mark their passage through the desert. The total absence of evidence seemed to suggest forces beyond normal natural phenomena. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing some 75 years after the event, would become the primary source for our knowledge of the lost army. But even Herodotus, famous for his meticulous research and extensive travels, could only repeat the stories he had heard from Egyptian priests and desert dwellers. He had no Persian sources for the disaster, a fact that itself tells us something significant about how completely the expedition had been erased from imperial records. What Herodotus recorded was a tale that seemed to blend historical fact with elements that bordered on the supernatural. According to his sources, the army had made good progress across the desert until that fateful midday halt. The storm that destroyed them was described not merely as severe weather, but as something apocalyptic winds that seemed to carry the very wrath of the gods, sand that moved with purpose and intelligence, a tempest that targeted the Persian force with almost supernatural precision. The complete absence of survivors was perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the entire affair. 50,000 men do not march in a single tight formation, particularly not in desert terrain where spreading out reduces the risk of getting lost or running short of water. There should have been scouts ranging ahead of the main body, rear guards trailing behind, foraging parties sent out to hunt for additional water sources. Even the most catastrophic storm should have spared at least a few men who were separated from the main force. Yet, no Persian soldier ever returned to tell what happened during those final hours in the desert. No dying man stumbled into an oasis with news of the disaster. No equipment was ever found by later travelers along the route. It was as if the entire expedition had been lifted bodily from the earth and transported to some realm beyond human knowledge. This total disappearance had profound consequences for Persian policy in Egypt and beyond. Cambyses, already unstable, according to many ancient sources, reportedly fell into a rage that bordered on madness when news of the army's fate reached him. The king who had conquered Egypt and declared himself pharaoh had been humiliated by forces he could not understand, let alone control. His grand expedition to destroy the Oracle of Siwa had ended not in glorious victory, but in inexplicable catastrophe. More practically, the loss of 50,000 veteran soldiers severely weakened Persian control over their newly conquered Egyptian territories. These were not raw recruits, but experienced warriors whose absence left dangerous gaps in the imperial military structure. Local Egyptian rebels, who had been cowed by the overwhelming display of Persian might during the initial conquest, began to sense opportunity in the empire's sudden vulnerability. The political ramifications extended far beyond Egypt's borders. Throughout the Persian Empire, subject peoples who had submitted to imperial rule out of fear rather than loyalty began to whisper that perhaps the King of Kings was not as invincible as his propaganda proclaimed. If the desert gods could destroy a Persian army without leaving a trace, what other divine forces might be marshaled against imperial ambitions? In the great cities of the empire, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis courtiers and administrators who had built their careers on Persian expansion suddenly found themselves questioning the wisdom of unlimited imperial growth. The disaster in Egypt demonstrated that there were limits to what Persian arms could achieve, boundaries beyond which even the mightiest empire dared not venture without risking complete annihilation. The psychological impact on the Persian military was equally significant. Soldiers who had once marched confidently into battle believing in their inevitable victory now carried with them the knowledge that entire armies could vanish without warning. Desert campaigns became objects of particular dread, and commanders found it increasingly difficult to maintain morale when operating in environments that seemed actively hostile to human presence. But perhaps most troubling of all was the silence that surrounded the disaster in official Persian records. Where we might expect to find detailed accounts of what went wrong, analysis of the strategic mistakes that led to catastrophe, or at least acknowledgement of the massive loss of life, there is instead a void. It is as if the Persian imperial administration decided that the best way to handle the embarrassment was to pretend it had never happened at all. This official silence created its own problems. Without honest analysis of what had gone wrong in the desert, Persian commanders were condemned to repeat the same mistakes in future campaigns. The empire's military doctrine, built on the assumption that superior numbers and organization could overcome any obstacle, remained unchanged, despite clear evidence that some challenges lay beyond conventional military solutions. The silence also allowed legend and speculation to fill the void left by missing facts. In the absence of official Persian accounts, the story of the lost army became the property of storytellers, poets, and mythmakers who embellished it with supernatural elements that may have obscured whatever historical truth lay beneath. Each retelling added new details, new interpretations, new layers of mystery that made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. This pattern of official silence followed by legendary elaboration would become a recurring theme in the story of Cambyses' lost army. For over 2 millennia, the disappearance would remain locked in the realm of legend, neither fully believed nor entirely dismissed. It occupied that strange middle ground between history and myth, too well documented to be pure fantasy, but too extraordinary to be accepted as conventional historical fact. The immediate aftermath of the disaster saw frantic Persian efforts to maintain control over their Egyptian territories, despite the massive loss of military strength. Replacement troops were rushed in from other parts of the empire, but these fresh forces lacked the experience and local knowledge of the vanished veterans. Egyptian priests, sensing Persian weakness, became increasingly bold in their resistance to imperial religious policies. Local administrators found their authority questioned by populations who had witnessed the limits of Persian power. Cambyses himself seems to have been psychologically shattered by the catastrophe. Ancient sources describe a king consumed by paranoia and rage, lashing out at advisors who brought unwelcome news and making increasingly erratic decisions that further destabilized Persian rule in Egypt. Whether these accounts reflect historical reality or later propaganda designed to explain Persian failures, they suggest that the loss of the army had consequences that extended far beyond mere military setback. The king's mental state deteriorated to such an extent that some sources suggest he began to see divine punishment in every misfortune that befell his reign. The Oracle of Siwa, which he had sought to destroy, seemed to mock him from its remote desert sanctuary, its priests, no doubt spreading word that their god had successfully defended his sacred precinct against Persian sacrilege. But the desert that had swallowed his army was not finished with Cambyses. According to multiple ancient sources, the Persian king died under mysterious circumstances in 522 BCE, less than 2 years after the disappearance of his desert expedition. Some accounts suggest suicide, others assassination, still others divine retribution for his hubris in challenging the gods of Egypt. The exact cause remains as mysterious as the fate of his lost soldiers. With Cambyses' death, The Persian Empire faced a succession crisis that threatened to tear apart everything his father Cyrus had built. The new king, Darius I, would spend the early years of his reign crushing rebellions and reasserting imperial authority. When stability was finally restored, one of Darius's first priorities was to conduct a thorough review of what had gone wrong during his predecessor's reign. It was during this review that the official Persian silence around the lost army was likely established. Darius and his advisors understood that dwelling on military disasters served no useful purpose and might actually encourage further rebellions by suggesting Persian vulnerability. Better to let the story fade from memory than to preserve detailed records that could be used by enemies of the empire. This deliberate forgetting had the perverse effect of ensuring that the story would never truly die. By refusing to provide their own account of what happened in the desert, the Persians guaranteed that other versions would fill the void. Egyptian accounts that emphasized divine intervention, Greek interpretations that focused on Persian arrogance and folly, local desert legends that transformed the disaster into myth. And so the mystery deepened with each passing generation, as the silence of the desert merged with the silence of the imperial archives to create a void that would haunt the imagination for millennia to come. The mystery that began in the sands of ancient Egypt would not remain buried there. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the story of Cambyses' vanished army evolved into something far greater than a simple military disaster. It became a puzzle that would obsess archaeologists, adventurers, and treasure hunters across the ages, each generation convinced they held the key to solving what their predecessors could not. In the medieval Islamic world, Arab historians preserved fragments of the tale, weaving it into their chronicles of ancient pharaohs and forgotten kingdoms. To them, the Persian army's fate served as a reminder that Allah's will could humble even the mightiest conquerors. The desert, they wrote, was a place of testing where pride met its inevitable punishment, and the 50,000 soldiers had simply failed that divine examination. When European explorers began penetrating the mysteries of Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, the lost army captured their imagination with unprecedented force. Here was the perfect combination of historical intrigue and treasure-hunting opportunity. Napoleon's scholars, marching alongside his armies during the Egyptian campaign, included the missing Persians in their catalogues of ancient mysteries to be solved. British and German archaeologists, racing to uncover Egypt's secrets, added the lost army to their ever-growing list of discoveries that would cement their reputations forever. The Victorian age, with its faith in scientific progress and mechanical precision, was particularly seduced by the challenge. If steam engines could cross continents and telegraph wires could span oceans, surely modern methods could locate 50,000 buried soldiers. Expeditions were mounted with military precision, equipped with the latest surveying instruments, and staffed by experts in geology, archaeology, and desert navigation. Yet the sands refused to yield their secret. Each failed expedition only deepened the mystery's allure. The Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi, who would later inspire characters in literature and film, spent decades combing the western desert for traces of the vanished Persians. His maps, marked with promising locations and frustrated by endless disappointments, became testaments to the desert's ability to guard its secrets against even the most determined intrusion. The 20th century brought new technologies and renewed hope. Ground-penetrating radar promised to see beneath the sand's surface. Satellite imagery offered bird's-eye perspectives of terrain that had never been properly surveyed. Computer analysis could process weather patterns and predict where ancient storms might have deposited their victims. Yet still the desert remained silent, its secret as well guarded as ever. In 1983, a massive expedition funded by Harvard University and the National Geographic Society deployed cutting-edge equipment across 100 square kilometers of promising terrain. For 6 months, teams of geologists and archaeologists methodically searched the most likely areas, following computer models that identified where a catastrophic sandstorm might have buried evidence of the Persian disaster. They found pottery shards, fragments of ancient settlements, traces of long-vanished caravan routes, but nothing that could definitively be linked to Cambyses' lost soldiers. And so, 25 centuries after 50,000 Persian warriors marched into the endless sands, their fate remains as mysterious as the desert winds that claimed them. Perhaps they lie still beneath the dunes, waiting for the right storm to reveal their bronze armor to the sun once more. Perhaps they were victims not of nature's wrath, but of human ambition meeting forces beyond its understanding. Or perhaps the desert simply chose to keep this one secret, adding their story to the countless others buried beneath its shifting surface. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the whisper of ancient winds carry you into dreams where empires rise and fall like grains of sand, and some mysteries are meant to remain forever unsolved. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the vast library of history, the most haunting tales are often those with missing pages.